My name is Hayley Richardson, and I'm 28 years old. 3 months ago, I thought I knew what family meant. Today, I watched my sister Tiffany tremble in handcuffs as the judge read her sentence. The same hands that once held my inhaler while I gasped for air, the same mouth that sneered, "Gasp, loser," as I nearly died, now shook with fear. The courtroom was silent except for her shallow breathing. Ironic, isn't it? She who had stolen my breath was now struggling for her own. As the bailiff led her away, our eyes met one last time. No more sneering. No more cruelty. Just the hollow stare of someone who had finally faced the consequences of their actions. The gavel fell, and with it, years of abuse came to an end. Before we dive into this story that changed my life forever, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If this story resonates with you or someone you know, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories of survival and justice. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, in a family where love was conditional and cruelty was disguised as sibling rivalry. Growing up as the Richardson family's afterthought wasn't just difficult, it was suffocating in the most literal sense. From the moment I drew my first wheezing breath, my severe asthma marked me as the broken one, the expensive one, the disappointment. While other babies cried for attention, I fought for oxygen, and that difference shaped everything that followed. My parents, Carol and Brian Richardson, never let me forget that I was costing them thousands in medical bills while my older sister Tiffany excelled effortlessly at everything she touched. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Tiffany was the golden child with perfect lungs, perfect grades, and a perfect smile that charmed teachers and relatives alike. I was the sickly one, with an emergency inhaler permanently attached to my backpack, wheezing through PE class while she won track medals. Our house had 2 sets of rules. Tiffany's room was a shrine to achievement, walls covered with ribbons, trophies, and honor roll certificates. Mine was sparse, practical, designed around my medical needs with an air purifier humming constantly and medications organized on my nightstand like a pharmacy display. When Tiffany wanted something, it appeared. When I needed something, it required a family discussion about budgets and sacrifices. The favoritism wasn't subtle. It was broadcasted daily through 1,000 small moments that taught me my place in the family hierarchy. Tiffany attended expensive private schools while I navigated overcrowded public classrooms. She received a car for her 16th birthday, while I got a lecture about being grateful for what I had. But perhaps nothing revealed their true feelings more than how they handled my asthma attacks. While Tiffany's scraped knees received immediate attention and sympathy, my respiratory emergencies were treated like inconvenient interruptions. My mother would sigh dramatically while reaching for my rescue inhaler, muttering about how I needed to learn to manage my condition better. My father viewed each ER visit as a personal financial assault, often commenting loudly about the cost of my existence. Tiffany learned early that my vulnerability was something to exploit, not protect. She began hiding my inhalers as a game, when we were children, watching with fascination as I panicked and searched frantically. When I'd find my medication and confront her, she'd laugh and say she was just playing. My parents never punished these games. Instead, they suggested I should keep better track of my belongings. The pattern established in childhood only intensified as we grew older. By high school, the differences in our treatment had created a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. While Tiffany coasted through her prestigious private school with minimal effort, I worked part-time jobs to supplement my basic needs and save money for college. My parents made it clear that Tiffany's education was their investment in the family's future, while mine was viewed as a questionable expense. They weren't wrong about one thing: I was expensive. My medical costs were substantial, but what they never acknowledged was how their emotional neglect made everything worse. Stress was my biggest asthma trigger, and living in constant tension created a cycle where their disappointment in my condition made my condition worse, which generated more disappointment. The breaking point came during my senior year, when I received a full academic scholarship to a respected state university. Instead of celebration, my achievement was met with suspicion and resentment. How could their sick, struggling daughter succeed where their perfect child had stumbled? Tiffany had been forced to leave her expensive private college after failing multiple classes, despite my parents paying full tuition. My scholarship represented everything they couldn't understand, that being underestimated had made me stronger, that fighting for breath had taught me to fight for everything else. The announcement of my scholarship at the dinner table was met with silence until Tiffany finally spoke. "Well, I guess they have quotas for sick kids now," she said, and my parents nodded in agreement. That night, lying in my room listening to the air purifier's familiar hum, I made a decision that would define my adult life. I would prove them wrong not through confrontation, but through success. I would build a life so far removed from their toxicity that their opinions would become irrelevant. What I didn't understand then was that leaving toxic family behind doesn't mean they'll leave you behind. Some people can't stand watching others rise above the limitations they've tried to impose. And some people will go to extraordinary lengths to pull you back down to where they think you belong. The invitation to my mother's 58th birthday dinner came with strings attached, as family obligations always did. Despite years of minimal contact since college, Carol Richardson expected my presence, and declining wasn't really an option if I wanted to maintain any semblance of family relationship. I had spent 3 weeks selecting the perfect gift, an antique pearl necklace that had cost me 2 months of savings from my marketing job. It was elegant, expensive, and chosen specifically to show that I had risen above their expectations of the sick child they remembered. As I drove to their suburban home that April evening, my inhaler was safely tucked in my purse, a precaution I never traveled without, especially when visiting family. Stress and family gatherings were a dangerous combination for my respiratory system. The house looked exactly the same: manicured lawn, perfect flower beds, and an interior that screamed upper-middle-class respectability. Tiffany's car was already in the driveway, a sleek sedan that our parents had undoubtedly helped her purchase after her latest job loss. Inside, the familiar cast of characters had assembled: aunts and uncles who barely acknowledged my existence, cousins who had been raised on stories of my dramatic medical episodes, and parents who greeted me with the kind of forced politeness reserved for unwelcome, but necessary guests. The dining room table was set with their finest china, and I carefully placed my wrapped gift among the others, most of which were clearly more expensive than my carefully chosen offering. Tiffany looked stunning, as always. At 32, she had maintained the effortless beauty that had made her the family favorite, though I noticed a hardness around her eyes that hadn't been there in our youth. Her greeting was warm enough for the audience, but carried the familiar undertone of condescension that had characterized our relationship since childhood. "Little sister. So glad you could make it. How's the job at that marketing company? Still doing well, or?" She let the question hang, implying uncertainty about my continued employment. The conversation continued in this vein throughout cocktails, with Tiffany masterfully steering discussions to highlight her superiority while subtly undermining my achievements. When gift opening time arrived, I watched nervously as my mother unwrapped present after present with appropriate enthusiasm. The pearl necklace was opened last, and I held my breath as she examined it carefully. The silence stretched uncomfortably long before she spoke. "Hayley, it's lovely, really. But we don't need your charity. You should save your money for your medical expenses." The words hit like a physical blow, made worse by the approving nods from other family members. Tiffany's laugh was particularly cruel. "Oh, Mom, maybe she got it on clearance. You know how she hunts for bargains." The humiliation was complete, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that signaled the beginning of an asthma attack. I tried to excuse myself quietly, reaching into my purse for my rescue inhaler while explaining that I needed some air. But Tiffany was faster. She had always been faster. Before I could grasp the small plastic device, her hand shot out and seized it, holding it just out of my reach with a smile that turned predatory. "Oh look, the baby needs her medicine," she announced to the room, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. My breathing was becoming labored now, the familiar panic setting in as my airways began to constrict. I reached for the inhaler, but she pulled it away, dancing it just beyond my fingertips like a playground bully with a stolen toy. "Please, Tiffany," I managed between increasingly difficult breaths. "I need that. Now." But my desperation only seemed to fuel her enjoyment. She held the inhaler up like a trophy, examining it with exaggerated interest. "Gasp, loser," she said, her voice cutting through the room with surgical precision. "Maybe you'll finally learn to breathe like a normal person." The words were delivered with such casual cruelty that several family members actually chuckled, as if my struggle for breath was entertainment rather than emergency. My lips were beginning to turn blue, my vision starting to blur around the edges. 28 years of living with asthma had taught me to recognize the signs of a severe attack, and this was rapidly becoming life-threatening. The room seemed to spin as I fought for air that wouldn't come. My chest felt like it was being crushed in a vice, each attempted breath producing only a high-pitched wheeze that grew fainter with each cycle. I collapsed into a dining room chair, clutching at my throat instinctively, though I knew it wouldn't help. Through my panic, I could hear voices, some concerned, others dismissive, but they seemed to come from very far away. Tiffany still held my inhaler, though her smile had faded as she realized the severity of what was happening. My father's voice cut through the chaos. "She's just being dramatic. This is exactly why we can't have nice family gatherings." But my mother's voice carried a note of genuine alarm. "Tiffany, give her the inhaler. She's turning purple." Just as consciousness began to slip away, Dr. Elena Martinez, our elderly neighbor, who had been invited to the party, pushed through the crowd with the authority of her medical training. She grabbed the inhaler from Tiffany's suddenly slack grip and administered 2 quick puffs directly into my mouth, supporting my head, as she coached me through the process of getting medication into my constricted lungs. "Slow breaths, Haley. Let the medicine work. You're going to be okay." Her voice was calm and professional, a stark contrast to the chaos around us. As the medication began to take effect and my breathing slowly improved, I looked around the room at my family's faces. Not one showed remorse. Only annoyance at the disruption of their celebration. The ambulance ride to Hartford General Hospital felt surreal, with EMTs monitoring my oxygen levels while I processed what had just happened. Dr. Martinez had insisted on calling 911 despite my family's protests, that I was fine now, and didn't need medical attention. The paramedics disagreed with that assessment, noting dangerously low blood oxygen levels and the need for immediate monitoring. As the emergency room staff worked to stabilize my breathing with nebulizer treatments and 4 steroids, I found myself alone. Not one family member had followed the ambulance or called to check on my condition. The silence from my phone was deafening, speaking volumes about where I stood in their priorities. Dr. Stephen Walsh, the attending emergency physician, delivered news that confirmed my worst fears about the attack's severity. "Ms. Richardson, you came very close to respiratory failure tonight. Another few minutes, without your rescue medication, could have resulted in permanent lung damage or worse." He explained that the prolonged lack of oxygen had stressed my cardiovascular system, and that the delay in treatment had turned what should have been a manageable episode into a medical emergency. He recommended a 3-day hospital stay for observation and adjustment of my medications, noting that the trauma of the event might have long-lasting effects on my asthma management. The hospital room became my sanctuary and prison for the next 72 hours. While I received excellent medical care, the emotional isolation was crushing. My phone remained silent except for work emails and a few concerned texts from colleagues who had noticed my absence. No flowers arrived. No visitors stopped by. Even more telling was the complete absence of any acknowledgement that the evening had gone wrong. It was as if my medical emergency had been erased from family memory, dismissed as an inconvenient interruption rather than a life-threatening crisis. When Dr. Martinez visited on my second day, bringing homemade soup and genuine concern, I broke down completely. They could have killed me, I sobbed, finally allowing myself to voice what I had been thinking. Dr. Martinez listened with the patience of someone who had witnessed too much human cruelty in her 40 years of medical practice. She had been our neighbor for over a decade and had seen the family dynamics up close, though I had never spoken openly about the treatment I received. "Haley," she said carefully, "what happened that night wasn't normal sibling behavior. Withholding life-saving medication from someone in medical distress is assault. You could have died, and your sister knew that." Her words carried the weight of medical and legal authority, though I wasn't ready to hear them yet. My phone finally rang on the third day, but the conversation with my mother only deepened my despair. Carol's voice was cold and matter-of-fact, as she delivered what she clearly considered a reasonable explanation. "Haley, you embarrassed us in front of our friends and family. Tiffany was just playing around, and you turned it into a whole production. Dr. Martinez had no business calling an ambulance when you were obviously fine. Now people are talking about our family like we're some kind of abusive household." The accusation in her voice was unmistakable. I was the problem, not the sister who had nearly killed me for entertainment. When I tried to explain the seriousness of what had occurred, my mother's response was swift and definitive. "You've always been overly dramatic about your breathing problems. Half the time, I think you bring these attacks on yourself for attention. Tiffany is devastated that you're trying to blame her for your medical issues. If you can't handle family gatherings without creating drama, maybe it's better if you don't attend them." The conversation ended with an ultimatum disguised as maternal advice. "You need to decide if you want to be part of this family, or if you want to keep playing the victim. We won't tolerate you making Tiffany the villain in your medical fairy tales." The call left me stunned and questioning my own perception of events. Had I overreacted? Was withholding my inhaler really just a harmless prank that I had blown out of proportion? The doubt was insidious, creeping into every corner of my mind and making me wonder if my family was right about my tendency toward drama. It was Dr. Martinez's follow-up visit that afternoon that pulled me back to reality. "Haley, I've been a physician for 4 decades. I've seen countless asthma attacks, and what happened to you was deliberately induced and prolonged. Your sister's actions were criminal, not playful. Don't let them convince you otherwise." Her words were exactly what I needed to hear, but they also forced me to confront a terrible truth. My family was willing to gaslight me about a near-death experience to protect their golden child. Returning to my apartment after the hospitalization felt like entering a different world. The quiet space, filled with books and plants and the absence of hostility, stood in stark contrast to the toxic environment I had just escaped. For weeks, I tried to resume my normal routine, but the trauma of nearly dying while my family watched with indifference had changed something fundamental inside me. Sleep was elusive, haunted by dreams of gasping for air while Tiffany laughed. Work became difficult as concentration problems plagued my days, and my supervisor began expressing concern about my performance. The isolation was complete: no family contact, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no apology for behavior that had nearly cost me my life. Dr. Martinez's suggestion to seek legal counsel had been floating in my mind since our hospital conversation, but I had dismissed it as too extreme. Normal families didn't sue each other. Normal sisters didn't try to murder their siblings with their own medical conditions. But as I sat in my apartment one evening, unable to breathe properly due to anxiety, and still feeling the phantom sensation of my airways closing, I realized that nothing about my family was normal. I began researching attorneys online, looking for someone who specialized in assault cases and had experience with unusual circumstances. The search felt surreal. Shopping for legal representation against my own sister for attempted murder by asthma attack. Jake Thompson's law office occupied a converted Victorian house downtown, and his receptionist scheduled a consultation for the following week. Walking into that building felt like crossing a line from which there would be no return. Jake himself was younger than I expected, probably in his mid-30s, with kind eyes and a manner that immediately put me at ease. When I explained the circumstances of my case, I watched his expression shift from polite interest to genuine alarm. "Ms. Richardson," he said carefully, "what you're describing isn't a family dispute. It's aggravated assault. Your sister deliberately withheld life-saving medication during a medical emergency. That's a felony in Connecticut." Initially, Jake was skeptical about the strength of the case. Family disputes were notoriously difficult to prosecute, and the behavior I described seemed almost too cruel to be believable. But as we discussed the details, the deliberate nature of Tiffany's actions, the witnesses present, the medical documentation of my emergency, his interest grew. "We'll need evidence," he explained. "Testimony alone won't be enough, especially when it's your word against your family's. But if we can prove what happened that night, this becomes a very strong case." He gave me homework: gather any documentation from that evening, identify potential witnesses, and most importantly, find out if there was any security footage from neighboring houses. The investigation phase felt like detective work mixed with archaeology. I started with Dr. Martinez, who agreed to provide both medical testimony and witness statements about what she observed that evening. Her decades of medical experience would be crucial in establishing the severity of the attack and the criminal negligence involved in delaying treatment. Next came the challenge of security footage. The Richardson family home was in an upscale neighborhood where privacy was valued, but many houses had discreet security systems. After canvassing the street and explaining my situation to neighbors, I discovered that the house directly across from my parents' had outdoor cameras that captured their driveway and front entrance. The homeowners, an elderly couple named the Hendersons, were initially hesitant to get involved in what seemed like a family dispute. But when I explained that I had nearly died and was seeking justice for assault, they agreed to review their security footage from that evening. What we found was beyond my hopes: a clear view of the ambulance arrival, EMTs rushing into the house, and my eventual emergence on a stretcher with oxygen equipment. More importantly, the timestamp showed the ambulance had been on scene for over 20 minutes, contradicting any claim that this had been a minor incident. The footage also captured family members standing casually on the porch during the emergency, showing no signs of concern or distress. As our case strengthened, Tiffany's counterattack began. I started noticing cars following me home from work and phone calls that hung up when I answered. My apartment building's security mentioned that someone had been asking questions about my schedule and habits. When I mentioned these incidents to Jake, his expression turned serious. "Your sister is running scared," he said. "People don't hire private investigators unless they know they are in trouble." We need to be extra careful now and document everything. He recommended security measures and helped me obtain a restraining order that required Tiffany to stay at least 500 feet away from my home and workplace. The private investigator harassment was just the beginning. Within a week of filing the restraining order, I received a termination notice from my marketing job. The reason given was performance issues and reliability concerns, but the timing was suspicious. My supervisor, who had been supportive during my recovery, seemed uncomfortable when delivering the news and avoided eye contact throughout our final meeting. Later, through a mutual friend, I learned that someone claiming to be conducting a background check had contacted my employer with questions about my mental health and stability. The sabotage was systematic and calculated, designed to destroy my credibility and my ability to financially sustain a legal battle. The final straw came in the form of emails that began appearing in my inbox. The messages were sent from anonymous accounts, but contained personal information that could only have come from family members. They detailed my childhood medical history, made accusations about mental instability, and threatened to expose the truth about my manipulative behavior if I didn't drop the lawsuit. One email included photos taken outside my apartment building, making it clear that the surveillance was ongoing. Jake immediately involved law enforcement, and the emails were traced back to IP addresses associated with my parents' home network. What had started as a civil lawsuit was rapidly becoming a criminal conspiracy case. The formal filing of assault charges against Tiffany Richardson made headlines in the local news, though the coverage was not what I had expected. The story was framed as a family dispute gone wrong, with subtle implications that I might be using the legal system to settle personal grievances. Tiffany's response was swift and professional. She hired Morrison, Blake & Associates, one of Hartford's most expensive law firms, to represent her. Their strategy became clear within days: portray me as an unstable, vindictive sister using false medical claims to destroy an innocent family member. The public relations war had begun, and I was clearly outgunned. Tiffany's first court appearance was a masterclass in manipulation. She arrived dressed conservatively in navy blue, accompanied by both our parents and her high-powered legal team. To observers, she looked like the victim, composed, dignified, and bewildered by the accusations against her. Her attorney, Catherine Morrison, was equally impressive, projecting an image of confident professionalism that made my public defender look like an amateur by comparison. During the preliminary hearing, Morrison argued that the charges were baseless, stemming from a family disagreement that had been blown out of proportion by an emotionally unstable plaintiff with a history of attention-seeking behavior. The countersuit came exactly 1 week later. Tiffany was suing me for defamation, false accusations, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The lawsuit claimed that my allegations had damaged her reputation, caused her to lose employment opportunities, and subjected her to public humiliation and death threats from strangers who had read about the case. The monetary damages sought were staggering: $200,000 in compensation plus punitive damages. Jake explained that this was a common intimidation tactic, designed to force settlement negotiations by making the cost of fighting prohibitive. Morrison's public relations campaign was devastatingly effective. Somehow, my complete medical history began appearing in court filings, painting a picture of someone with chronic health problems and a pattern of blaming others for personal struggles. Details about my hospitalizations throughout childhood were presented as evidence of attention-seeking behavior rather than legitimate medical emergencies. My employment termination was cited as proof of instability and poor judgment. Most damaging was the character assassination disguised as legal strategy. I was portrayed as a bitter, unsuccessful sister jealous of Tiffany's achievements and happiness. The family's united front was perhaps the most painful aspect of the legal proceedings. At every hearing, Carol and Brian Richardson sat prominently in the gallery, presenting themselves as grieving parents caught between two daughters they loved equally. Their statements to the media were carefully crafted masterpieces of manipulation. They spoke sadly about my struggles with mental health and their hopes for healing and reconciliation. They painted Tiffany as the responsible child who had always tried to help her sick sister, making my accusations seem like the paranoid delusions of an ungrateful daughter. My financial situation became increasingly desperate as legal costs mounted and employment remained elusive. Jake was working largely pro bono, but court fees, expert witnesses, and investigation costs were substantial. Meanwhile, Tiffany seemed to have unlimited resources backing her defense. Private investigators continued monitoring my activities, looking for any behavior that could be used to support their narrative of instability. Phone calls to potential employers resulted in rejections that felt coordinated and suspicious. The message was clear: drop the lawsuit or face complete social and economic destruction. The turning point came when Jake's investigation uncovered Tiffany's history of violent behavior in her marriage. Her divorce proceedings, which had been sealed by court order, contained disturbing allegations of domestic abuse and psychological manipulation. Her ex-husband, Marcus Rivera, had documented years of increasingly violent behavior that culminated in a restraining order and emergency protective custody for their children. The pattern was identical to what I had experienced: escalating cruelty masked as playful teasing, followed by gaslighting and denial when confronted. Marcus had been too intimidated to pursue criminal charges, but his testimony would be devastating to Tiffany's image as the innocent victim. The discovery of additional victims changed everything about our case strategy. Jake's team identified 3 other individuals who had been targeted by Tiffany's systematic harassment and abuse over the years. A former roommate in college described months of psychological torture disguised as friendship. A co-worker from her previous job detailed a campaign of sabotage and manipulation that had resulted in wrongful termination. Each story followed the same pattern: initial charm and friendship, followed by increasingly cruel behavior, then complete denial and victim blaming when confronted. The prosecution now had a pattern of behavior that showed the asthma attack wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a lifelong practice of sadistic abuse. Armed with new evidence and witness testimony, our legal strategy shifted from defense to offense. Jake filed motions to include Tiffany's history of domestic violence and workplace harassment as evidence of established pattern behavior. The move was risky. Pattern evidence could backfire if the judge viewed it as prejudicial character assassination rather than relevant behavioral history. But the medical evidence was becoming impossible for the defense to dismiss, particularly when combined with Dr. Martinez's expert testimony about the life-threatening nature of my asthma attack and the criminal negligence involved in delaying treatment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The Henderson family's security system had audio recording capabilities that we hadn't initially discovered. The sound quality was poor, but forensic enhancement revealed fragments of conversation from that terrible evening. Most crucially, it captured Tiffany's voice clearly saying "Gasp, loser," followed by laughter from multiple family members. The recording also included my desperate pleas for my inhaler and the frightening sound of my labored breathing. When played in court, the audio was devastating. No jury could listen to that recording and dismiss it as harmless family teasing. Tiffany's desperation became evident when she attempted to approach me directly, violating the restraining order in a calculated gamble. The meeting occurred in the parking lot of my doctor's office, where she apparently hoped to catch me in a vulnerable moment. Security cameras captured the entire encounter, as she pleaded for me to be reasonable and drop the charges. What she didn't realize was that Jake had equipped me with a recording device after previous harassment attempts. The conversation, she thought, would save her instead provided the final piece of evidence we needed. "Look, Haley," this has gone far enough," Tiffany said, her voice carrying the same condescending tone I remembered from childhood. "You know I never meant to hurt you. It was just sister stuff, the way we've always interacted. Drop this stupid lawsuit, and we can all move on." When I remained silent, she became more aggressive. "You're destroying our family over a little breathing problem. Mom and Dad are heartbroken. Do you really want to send your own sister to prison over a misunderstanding?" The recording device captured every word as she tried to minimize attempted murder to a simple misunderstanding. But the most incriminating part came when I asked directly whether she understood that withholding my inhaler could have killed me. Her response was chilling in its honesty. "Oh please, you've been using that asthma thing to manipulate people your whole life. Maybe if you actually couldn't breathe for a few minutes, you'd learn not to be so dramatic about it. I was doing you a favor, teaching you some toughness." The casual admission of deliberately causing my medical emergency, while knowing the risks, was exactly what prosecutors needed to prove intent and premeditation. The recording also revealed the coordinated nature of my family's harassment campaign. Tiffany explicitly mentioned the private investigators, the employment sabotage, and the threatening emails as part of their strategy to force me to withdraw the charges. "We've made your life pretty difficult lately, haven't we? It's only going to get worse until you come to your senses." She had inadvertently confessed to conspiracy charges that could result in additional criminal liability for our parents. Jake was practically glowing when he heard the recording. We now had evidence of both the original assault and an ongoing criminal conspiracy. The family's reaction to being caught in conspiracy was predictable and devastating to their public image. Brian and Carol Richardson immediately hired separate legal representation and began distancing themselves from Tiffany's actions. Their public statements shifted from defending their daughter to expressing shock and disappointment at recent revelations about her behavior. The unified family front that had been their greatest strength crumbled as each member prioritized self-preservation over loyalty. Tiffany found herself isolated, her legal bills mounting while her support system evaporated. Media coverage began shifting in our favor as more details emerged about Tiffany's pattern of abusive behavior. The original narrative of a family dispute transformed into a story about domestic violence and the courage required to hold family members accountable for criminal actions. Victim advocacy groups rallied behind my case, recognizing the broader implications for other abuse survivors who faced similar intimidation tactics when seeking justice. The public pressure on prosecutors intensified, making it politically impossible to offer lenient plea bargains or dismiss charges. The defense team's strategy became increasingly desperate as their clients' credibility collapsed. Morrison attempted to portray the recorded conversation as entrapment, arguing that I had deliberately provoked Tiffany into making incriminating statements. When that failed, they tried claiming the recordings were edited or taken out of context. But forensic audio analysis confirmed the authenticity of every word, and the timestamps corresponded perfectly with security footage showing our meeting. Every legal maneuver seemed to make their position worse, generating additional evidence of bad faith and criminal behavior. The actual trial began on a crisp October morning that felt like the culmination of months of preparation and years of accumulated pain. The courthouse steps were crowded with media representatives, victim advocates, and curious observers drawn by the unusual nature of the case. As I walked through the gauntlet of cameras and microphones, flanked by Jake and Dr. Martinez, I felt the weight of representing not just my own experience, but the broader issue of family violence that too often remained hidden behind closed doors. The moment felt surreal, pursuing criminal charges against the sister who had once been my closest companion and my cruelest tormentor. Jury selection revealed the challenges we faced in presenting our case to people who couldn't imagine family members attempting murder through medical neglect. Many potential jurors expressed disbelief that anyone would deliberately withhold life-saving medication from a family member, viewing it as too extreme to be credible. Others worried about setting legal precedents that might criminalize normal family disagreements or childhood roughhousing. Jake spent considerable time during voir dire educating potential jurors about the realities of domestic violence and the medical seriousness of asthma attacks, gradually assembling a panel that could objectively evaluate evidence rather than dismiss it as impossible. Morrison's opening statement was a masterclass in victim blaming disguised as reasonable doubt. She painted me as an unstable, vengeful sister who had weaponized the legal system to destroy Tiffany's life over a misunderstood family interaction. According to her narrative, my asthma attack had been triggered by stress from the birthday party confrontation, not by deliberate medication withholding. Tiffany's momentary possession of my inhaler was portrayed as an attempt to calm me down, not malicious assault. The family's subsequent distancing was framed as reasonable self-protection against false accusations rather than evidence of guilt. It was persuasive, professionally delivered, and completely disconnected from reality. My own testimony was emotionally grueling, but necessary to establish the foundation of our case. Jake guided me through the events of that April evening, from the humiliating gift rejection to the terrifying sensation of my airways closing while my family watched. The hardest part was describing the look in Tiffany's eyes as she held my inhaler, not playful mischief, but calculated cruelty, as if she were experimenting to see how far she could push before I actually died. When I recounted her words, "Gasp, loser. Maybe you'll finally learn to breathe like a normal person," several jury members visibly recoiled. The recorded evidence of that statement, played immediately after my testimony, was devastating to the defense's narrative of innocent sibling interaction. Cross-examination was Morrison's opportunity to destroy my credibility, and she attacked with surgical precision. Every childhood medical emergency was reframed as attention-seeking behavior. My academic and professional successes were minimized while my recent unemployment was emphasized as evidence of instability. She spent considerable time on my relationship with Dr. Martinez, suggesting that an elderly neighbor had influenced my interpretation of events and encouraged legal action for her own agenda. The questioning was designed to make me appear paranoid, vindictive, and incapable of accurately perceiving reality. It was psychologically brutal, but Jake had prepared me well for the assault on my character. Dr. Martinez's testimony provided the medical authority our case needed to counter the defense's minimization strategy. Her 40 years of clinical experience and her status as a witness to the events gave her words tremendous credibility. She explained in detail how asthma attacks progress from manageable breathing difficulty to life-threatening respiratory failure, emphasizing that every minute without medication increases the risk of permanent damage or death. Her description of my condition when she intervened, blue lips, unconscious state, dangerously low oxygen levels, painted a picture of someone minutes away from death, not someone engaging in dramatic attention-seeking behavior. The security footage and audio recordings formed the centerpiece of our evidence presentation. Watching the enhanced video on courtroom screens, jury members could see the ambulance emergency response, the casual demeanor of family members during a medical crisis, and the extensive medical equipment required to stabilize my condition. The audio was even more powerful. Hearing my desperate pleas for medication, followed by Tiffany's cruel laughter, created a visceral reaction that no amount of legal maneuvering could dismiss. When the recording of her parking lot confession was played, several jury members stared directly at the defendant with expressions of disgust and disbelief. Tiffany's decision to testify in her own defense was a catastrophic miscalculation that revealed the depth of her narcissistic personality. Under direct examination, she presented herself as a loving sister concerned about my tendency toward medical drama and manipulation. She claimed that my asthma attacks were often psychosomatic responses to not getting attention, and that brief delays in medication access were sometimes necessary to help me develop coping skills. Her testimony was polished, confident, and completely undermined by the evidence we had presented. When Jake began cross-examination, the facade began cracking almost immediately. Ms. Richardson, Jake said calmly, when your sister was turning blue and gasping for air, what exactly were you teaching her? Tiffany's answer revealed everything about her character. I was teaching her that she can't control every situation with her breathing problems. Sometimes you have to be strong. The callousness was breathtaking. She had just admitted to deliberately prolonging a medical emergency as a form of psychological conditioning. When Jake played the audio of her saying, "Gasp, loser," Tiffany's only response was to claim she had been encouraging me to breathe harder. The jury's body language showed they weren't buying any of it. The final day of testimony brought closure to months of legal warfare and years of family trauma. Character witnesses for both sides painted contrasting pictures of the defendant. Former friends and colleagues describing Tiffany's pattern of manipulation and cruelty, while longtime family friends testified about her intelligence and charm. But the weight of evidence was overwhelming, and even sympathetic witnesses couldn't explain away the recordings of her admitting to deliberately causing my medical emergency. As closing arguments approached, it was clear that the defense had failed to create reasonable doubt about either the intent or the severity of Tiffany's actions. Jake's closing argument was passionate, but grounded in facts rather than emotion. He systematically walked through each piece of evidence, building an irrefutable case that Tiffany had committed aggravated assault by deliberately withholding life-saving medication during a medical emergency. He emphasized the premeditation involved. She hadn't acted impulsively, but had calculated that denying my inhaler would cause suffering she could enjoy. This wasn't a prank or a misunderstanding, he told the jury. This was attempted murder disguised as family interaction. Haley Richardson nearly died while her family watched, and her sister laughed about it. Morrison's closing was a desperate attempt to reframe overwhelming evidence as reasonable doubt. She argued that family dynamics are complex, that sibling relationships often involve teasing that outsiders might misinterpret, and that criminal courts shouldn't be used to settle family disputes. She suggested that my medical emergency was coincidental timing rather than criminal causation, that Tiffany's possession of my inhaler was momentary rather than deliberate, and that the recordings were taken out of context. It was professionally delivered, but fundamentally unconvincing given the mountain of evidence contradicting every claim. Jury deliberations lasted only 4 hours, suggesting that the evidence had been as clear to them as it was to everyone else in the courtroom. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all charges, aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy, Tiffany's composure finally cracked completely. The woman who had maintained perfect control throughout the trial began sobbing uncontrollably, reaching toward our parents, who turned away from her pleas for support. The family unity that had defined my childhood was completely shattered, with each member prioritizing self-preservation over loyalty to the daughter and sister who had caused this catastrophe. Sentencing occurred 3 weeks later, providing time for victim impact statements and pre-sentencing investigations. I had spent considerable time preparing my statement, trying to capture not just the physical trauma of nearly dying, but the psychological damage of being betrayed by the people who should have protected me. Standing at the podium facing my sister, I spoke directly to her for the first time since the parking lot confrontation. You didn't just steal my breath that night, Tiffany. You stole my ability to trust, to feel safe in the world, to believe that family means love instead of cruelty. But you also gave me something unintended, the strength to stand up to bullies, even when they share your DNA. Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Tiffany to 2 years in state prison followed by 3 years of supervised probation. The judge's comments were particularly pointed. Ms. Richardson, your actions went beyond sibling rivalry into the realm of attempted murder. You deliberately prolonged a life-threatening medical emergency for your own entertainment, then attempted to destroy your victim's credibility when she sought justice. This court cannot ignore such calculated cruelty. In addition to incarceration, Tiffany was ordered to pay $75,000 in restitution for medical expenses, lost wages, and legal costs. The restraining order was made permanent, ensuring that she could never contact me again. The civil conspiracy charges against my parents were resolved through plea agreements that required community service and substantial financial penalties, but no jail time. Their cooperation in the final phase of the prosecution had earned them leniency, though their reputations in the community were permanently damaged. The family business suffered as clients learned about their role in covering up domestic violence and harassment. Carol and Brian Richardson's golden retirement years were tainted by the knowledge that their favoritism and neglect had created a monster and nearly cost them both daughters. Media coverage of the sentencing focused on the broader implications of the case for domestic violence awareness and family accountability. Victim advocates celebrated the verdict as recognition that family relationships don't exempt anyone from criminal responsibility for violent behavior. Medical professionals used the case to educate the public about the seriousness of asthma attacks and the criminality of withholding necessary medications. Most importantly, other survivors of family violence began coming forward with their own stories, emboldened by the knowledge that the legal system could provide protection even against family members. As Tiffany was led away in handcuffs, she looked back one final time with an expression I couldn't quite read. It might have been remorse, though I suspected it was more likely anger at being held accountable for actions she had never expected to face consequences for. The woman who had terrorized my childhood and nearly ended my life was finally facing justice, but I felt surprisingly little satisfaction. The victory was necessary, but hollow. I had won the legal battle, but lost the family I had always hoped might someday love me. Sometimes justice looks different than we imagine, less like triumph and more like the end of a long, painful chapter we're finally allowed to close. 6 months after the sentencing, my life had transformed in ways I never could have imagined during those dark hospital days when everything seemed hopeless. The financial settlement allowed me to start over professionally, and the publicity from the case led to job opportunities with companies that valued my advocacy experience. I accepted a position with a non-profit organization focused on domestic violence prevention, using my legal background to help other survivors navigate the justice system. There was something profoundly healing about transforming my trauma into a tool for helping others escape similar situations. My asthma, ironically, had improved significantly since eliminating the stress of toxic family relationships from my life. The relationship with Jake Thompson had evolved naturally from professional to personal, built on the foundation of shared principles and mutual respect rather than romantic fantasy. He understood the complexities of family trauma in ways that most people couldn't, having represented numerous domestic violence survivors throughout his career. Our conversations weren't burdened by the need to explain why family violence is different from other crimes, why forgiveness isn't always possible or healthy, and why legal victory doesn't automatically heal psychological wounds. When he proposed during a quiet dinner at our favorite restaurant, his promise wasn't about romantic love alone, but about creating the kind of family that protects rather than destroys. Dr. Martinez had become the grandmother figure I had never experienced, offering wisdom gained through decades of medical practice and personal resilience. Her influence extended far beyond medical care to life guidance about forgiveness, healing, and the difference between reconciliation and enabling destructive behavior. She helped me understand that my family's rejection of responsibility wasn't personal failure, but character revelation. Their inability to acknowledge wrongdoing said nothing about my worthiness, and everything about their moral limitations. Her friendship filled the void left by family estrangement with something healthier and more sustainable. The non-profit work introduced me to dozens of survivors whose stories echoed mine in disturbing ways. Family members who used medical conditions as weapons, relatives who sabotaged employment and relationships, parents who gaslit children about abuse that left no physical scars. The common thread wasn't the specific tactics, but the systematic undermining of victims' reality and self-worth. Many survivors expressed gratitude that my case had received public attention, noting that media coverage helped them recognize their own situations as criminal rather than just unfortunate family dynamics. The ripple effects of speaking out continued expanding in directions I never anticipated. Tiffany's incarceration hadn't brought the closure I expected. Instead of satisfaction, I mostly felt sadness for the waste of potential and the family relationships that could never be repaired. Letters from prison arrived sporadically, mixing apologies with attempts to minimize her actions and blame others for the consequences she faced. I read them carefully, but never responded, recognizing the manipulation patterns that remained unchanged despite her circumstances. Her release date approached with a mixture of anxiety and indifference. She could no longer hurt me legally or physically, but the emotional scars would always make her presence in the world feel threatening. My parents' attempts at reconciliation were more painful than Tiffany's letters, because they carried the weight of lost possibilities rather than confirmed expectations. Carol called periodically with updates about family events and tentative invitations to holiday gatherings, always concluding with subtle guilt trips about forgiveness and family loyalty. Ryan's approach was more direct, offering financial support and practical assistance, as if money could repair decades of emotional neglect and recent betrayal. Both seemed genuinely confused about why I couldn't simply move past what they characterized as an unfortunate family crisis rather than systematic abuse and attempted murder. The permanent restraining order provided legal protection, but the psychological freedom came from finally accepting that some relationships are too toxic to preserve regardless of biological connections. Family therapy with Dr. Sarah Henderson helped me process the grief that comes with choosing estrangement over continued abuse. She helped me understand that mourning the family I never had was necessary before I could fully embrace the chosen family I was building. The work was difficult, but transformative, replacing childhood survival mechanisms with adult coping strategies based on self-worth rather than appeasement. Professional success in the advocacy field brought opportunities one had never imagined during my corporate marketing days. Speaking engagements at medical conferences educated healthcare providers about recognizing and reporting medical abuse. Legal symposiums used my case as an example of creative prosecution strategies for unconventional domestic violence scenarios. University classes studying family violence invited me to share first-hand perspectives on how abuse survivors navigate the justice system. Each speaking opportunity reinforced my transformation from victim to survivor to advocate, demonstrating that trauma could become a source of strength rather than just pain. The wedding planning process revealed how completely my definition of family had changed. Instead of relatives, who had spent years undermining my confidence and threatening my safety, our guest list included Dr. Martinez, colleagues who had become friends, survivors I had mentored, and legal professionals who had become chosen family. Jake's family embraced me with the warmth and acceptance I had spent 30 years seeking from people who shared my DNA. His parents' genuine excitement about our relationship stood in stark contrast to the conditional approval I had received from my own family when I achieved anything positive. As I write this, 18 months after that terrible April evening when my sister nearly killed me for entertainment, I'm struck by how differently my story ended than I ever expected. I thought healing would mean my family acknowledging their wrongdoing and changing their behavior. Instead, it meant recognizing that my worth wasn't determined by their approval, and my safety didn't require their participation in my life. The little girl, who spent decades trying to earn love from people incapable of giving it, had finally grown into a woman who could create love with people worthy of receiving it. The morning of our wedding, as I prepared to marry a man who had literally helped save my life, Dr. Martinez offered a piece of wisdom that perfectly captured my journey. Sometimes the family that hurts you the most teaches you how to love yourself the deepest. Looking back, I can see that every moment of my family's cruelty had been training me to recognize genuine love when it finally appeared. Their rejection had forced me to develop the strength and self-worth necessary to build something better. My sister's attempt to steal my breath had ultimately given me the voice to speak truth about family violence that others desperately needed to hear. Thank you for joining me on this journey from victim to survivor to advocate. If my story resonates with your own experience, or that of someone you love, please know that you're not alone, and that justice is possible even when it seems impossible. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and personal safety? How do you define family when biological relationships become toxic? Please hit that like button if this story helped you feel less alone in your own struggles, and subscribe for more real stories about surviving family trauma and finding healing. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that their family's treatment of them isn't their fault, and that they deserve so much better. Remember that healing isn't about forgiveness or reconciliation, it's about building a life where your safety and dignity are non-negotiable. Until next time, breathe freely and love yourself fiercely.